The great hall of Ironveil Keep had never burned brighter. Not fire, light. The kind that blinds you while you are still trying to believe in it. Hundreds of candles lined the stone walls in iron brackets, their flames trembling each time a warrior's fist slammed the long feasting tables in celebration. The smell of roasted boar and aged mead soaked into every corner of the keep. Tapestries of conquest rippled from the vaulted ceiling, heavy with silver thread and old blood. Outside, the night was bitter, midwinter, moonless, the mountains swallowed in dark. But inside Ironveil, the Frostmane pack was alive with something that felt like thunder, wearing a human face. They had just ended the Greyveil War, 4 territories, 6 weeks of battle, not one loss on their side. It was the kind of victory that rewrote history. But Ivana Moonridge was not celebrating. She stood on the curved stone gallery that overlooked the great hall, half hidden behind a thick column draped in silver velvet, and looked down at the crowd below. She stood on the curved stone gallery that overlooked the great hall. Her pale ivory gown fell soft around her ankles, the hem brushing the cold stone floor. Her dark hair was pinned at the nape of her neck, a few strands loose at her temples from the warmth rising off the crowd below. One hand rested at her side. The other, almost without thinking, had moved low, against her stomach. She had not meant to come to the gallery. She had only needed air. The celebration had made her feel invisible in a way that silence never quite managed. She had stood in the main hall for 20 minutes with a goblet she did not drink from, now smiling at people who looked slightly past her when they turned away. And then Viola Ashcroft, King Magnus's senior council advisor, a woman who wore her politeness like a blade's scabbard, had appeared at her elbow. "My queen, the Northern Lords are asking for your attendance in the East Corridor. Protocol." There were no Northern Lords in the East Corridor. Ivana had known that. She had gone anyway, Ivana standing alone on the upper stone gallery, partially hidden behind a velvet-draped column, looking down at the celebration. Soft, warm light hitting her face, but she feels detached. Because she was still learning which battles to pick, she had returned to the gallery instead, above the noise, above the light. And from here, through a gap in the celebrating crowd, she found her husband immediately. The King Magnus Frostmane was impossible to miss in any room. He stood near the center of the hall, tall, broad-shouldered, armored still in the dark wolf plate he had worn at the border. The silver crown of the Frostmane line sat on his dark hair like it had grown there. His jaw was hard, his posture easy in the way that powerful men's bodies know their own weight. He was the kind of man rooms reorganized themselves without him asking. He was laughing now, and wrapped loosely against his side, close, warm, with the effortless comfort of someone who had never once been told to step back, was Seraphine. Seraphine Varel, noble-born, redwood lineage, amber-haired, gold-dressed, beautiful in that particular way that looked completely accidental. She leaned into Magnus with her hand resting light against his arm, or her head tilting back as she laughed at something he said, and he looked down at her the way a man looks when he has forgotten the room exists. Ivana watched, her hand pressed, just slightly, tighter against her stomach. Then Viola Ashcroft appeared at Magnus's other elbow, dark gown, calm eyes, always measuring something no one else could see. She leaned in close, said something low. Seraphine's smile softened into something warmer, almost private. And Magnus, Ivana's husband, the man she had been bound to by law and blood, and a bond that had settled on her chest like stone the day of the mating ceremony, did not step back. Ivana moved closer to the gallery railing. The music dipped, and the voices rose, just enough, carried upward on a current of warm air. "She has no place in this hall tonight," Viola said, her tone perfectly conversational, as if she were discussing weather. "Not beside a king like you, not anymore." Seraphine laughed softly. Not cruel, just comfortable. She never really did. Magnus said nothing. He did not flinch. He did not look toward the gallery where his mate stood still in the dark above him. He simply lifted his goblet and drank, and the silence he gave them was answer enough. Ivana stood completely still. The celebration below did not pause. The music swelled back. A warrior overturned a bench somewhere to the left, and the crowd roared. Nobody looked up. Nobody noticed the Queen of Ironveil standing in the dark above them, her knuckles pale against the stone railing, her breath measured and deliberate. For 4 minutes, she stood there. She counted them. Then she turned. She walked quietly away from the railing. No stumble, no rush, her footsteps even on the cold stone floor. She descended the gallery stairs. She crossed the long corridor. She entered the chamber that was technically hers, though she had never quite been invited to make it so. She did not cry. She sat on the edge of the stone window seat in the dark, the muffled sound of the celebration still rising through the walls. And she thought, the way a woman thinks when she has been making hard decisions since she was very young. Clearly, without sentiment getting in the way. Her hand rested against her stomach. No one in that hall knew. No one in this entire keep knew what she was carrying, what had been quietly growing inside her for 7 weeks. The Alpha King's child, the Frostmane heir, or the future of the pack currently celebrating below her with no idea it was already decided. She looked at her hand in the dark. Then she stood. She did not take much, only what had been hers before Ironveil. She folded it neatly, packed it without sound. On the stone dressing table, she set down the silver pendant stamped with the Frostmane crest, the one Magnus had placed around her neck the morning after the bonding ceremony, the one time he had looked at her like she was real. She left it. No note. She walked through the corridors of Ironveil Keep, past the torchlit archways and the cold stone saints carved into the walls, and out through the eastern gate. The guards saw her. They said nothing. No one had thought to give orders about her leaving. No one had thought she would. The night air hit her like a wall of cold, or she breathed it in. She breathed it out. And by the time the first grey light touched the Ironveil Mountains, Ivana Moonridge would be gone. 3 months before the night of the gallery, Ivana Moonridge had arrived at Ironveil Keep in a borrowed dress and a borrowed smile. She was 23 years old. She had grown up in Silverfen, a smaller pack territory, nestled between 2 quiet rivers in the western lowlands, the kind of place where the healer knew every child by name, and harvest festivals lasted 3 days because nobody wanted them to end. Silverfen was not powerful. It was not feared. But it was warm in the particular way that communities are warm when they have chosen each other deliberately, year after year, through hard winters and harder losses. Her father, Aldrich Moonridge, was Silverfen's beta. A steady man, but a good one. Her mother, Lena, had died when Ivana was 11. There had been no slow warning, just a fever that came in fast and a healer who did everything right and still lost. Ivana remembered the morning after, with the strange, sharp clarity of a memory that has been pressed between the fingers too many times, the way the kitchen felt too large, the way her father sat at the table and looked at his hands like they belonged to someone else. She had made breakfast that morning. She was 11 years old. She had made breakfast, and she had kept making it, for her father, for her 2 younger brothers, Kale and Wren, because someone had to, and she was the one who knew where everything was. Nobody called her strong for this. It simply became the shape of her life. But by the time she was 17, she was running the household without thinking about it. By 20, she was helping coordinate Silverfenn's trading routes because their beta was aging, and she had a mind that remembered numbers the way other people remembered faces. She was not doing it to be seen. She was doing it because it needed doing. She had never thought much about the Alpha King of the Frostmane pack. Magnus Frostmane was a name that appeared in council dispatches and border agreements, a king 2 mountain territories north, known for his military precision and his cold efficiency, neither beloved nor hated by the packs that bordered him. He was powerful in the way that weather is powerful. You did not argue with it, you simply planned around it. The summons came on a Tuesday, delivered by 2 Frostmane riders in silver-crested armor. Her father called her into his study that evening, and the look on his face told her the answer before he finished asking the question. The Greyveil War had been building for 2 years, border skirmishes, territorial posturing, the kind of slow accumulation that everyone knows ends in something large and bloody. The Frostmane pack stood at the center of it, and the Territory Council, in its collective wisdom, had decided that a political mating alliance between Ironveil and Silverfen would secure the western lowland routes and remove one significant pressure point from Magnus's flank. Silverfen was small, Silverfen was loyal, and Silverfen had a beta's daughter of mating age who had no entanglements. She was not asked. She was told, gently, with full acknowledgement of the sacrifice, with her father's eyes wet at the corners, and his voice steady only because he had decided it would be. "You do not have to," he said, which was technically true and practically meaningless. And they both knew it. Silverfen could not afford to be on the wrong side of this war. 22 families. 214 people. Her brothers? She said yes. Not for herself. She said yes the way she had made breakfast the morning after her mother died. Because it needed doing. And she was the one standing in the kitchen. She met Magnus twice before the ceremony. The first meeting was formal, a territory council introduction, a long table, advisors on both sides, language so carefully measured, it said almost nothing. Magnus sat at the head of the table in his dark armor, and he looked at her the way he probably looked at all new information, with a kind of focused, impersonal attention that assessed without assuming. He was not unkind. He shook her hand at the end and said, "You are welcome at Ironveil, Miss Moonridge," and she had the distinct impression he meant it as a fact rather than a feeling. The second meeting was smaller, a brief council walk through the eastern grounds, arranged so they might speak without an audience. She had thought, going in, that this might be different, that perhaps stripped of the formal table and the advisors, he might be easier to read. He was not. He asked her about Silverfenn's trade routes. She answered. She asked him about Ironveil's winter supply system. He answered. They were both, she realized, a people who defaulted to competence when they did not know what else to offer. It was not unpleasant, but it was not warm. He held the door for her at the end of the walk. That was the kindest thing he did. The mating ceremony was held on a grey Thursday morning in Ironveil's great hall, the same hall that would, 3 months later, be blazing with victory celebration and her own quiet breaking. Then it was full of formal witnesses, council members, pack elders, the required representatives from both territories. Her father stood in the 3rd row. Kale had his hand on Wren's shoulder. She wore white, Ironveil tradition. Magnus wore his dark ceremonial armor, the silver crest polished to mirror brightness. He spoke the binding words in a clear, even voice. She spoke hers. The elder clasped their wrists together with the red cord, and then the bond landed. She had heard it described differently by different women, as warmth, as recognition, as coming home. For Ivana it felt like weight. Not painful, not wrong. Just settling, as if something had been added to the space behind her sternum that would now always be there, requiring accounting. She stood very still and let it settle. Magnus looked at her after the cord was removed. Just for a moment, and there was something in his expression she could not name. Not softness exactly. Something more like surprise, quickly filed away. "Thank you," he said, quietly, "for attending, for agreeing, for crossing 2 mountain territories and standing still while her life reorganized itself around a stranger." She said, "Of course." The weeks that followed had their own particular texture. Magnus was not cruel, though she had braced for cruelty and found instead something almost harder to navigate: absence. He was present at meals when protocol required it. He updated her on pack matters that concerned her household responsibilities, efficiently and completely. He thanked her when she handled something well. He was, by all measurable standards, considerate. But he did not see her. There is a difference between being acknowledged and being seen, and Ivana had learned it young enough to know the distinction without bitterness. He looked at her and registered her presence. He did not look at her and register her. She learned Ironveil instead. The keep's rhythms, its hierarchies, its small cruelties, and its genuine kindnesses. She learned which kitchen staff worked double shifts on council days and started leaving covered plates in the back corridor. She learned that the elderly groundskeeper, Petor, had bad knees and was too proud to ask for help, and she started quietly rerouting his morning routes. She did not do these things to be noticed. She did them because she was Ivana Moonridge, and she had been running a household since she was 11 years old, and this was simply a larger one. And on one of those early evenings, perhaps 3 weeks after the ceremony, she crossed paths with a broad-shouldered young man named Brennan, who worked the Ironveil armory and had the specific manner of someone pretending very hard not to care about anything. He had handed her a dropped satchel without looking at her. She had thanked him without looking at him either. He had almost smiled. She had almost smiled back. It was the first genuinely comfortable moment she had had since arriving at Ironveil. She filed it away carefully, the way you file away the things that feel like they might matter later. Brennan Ashkeld didn't like most people. This was not something he advertised. He simply arranged his days to minimize the number of conversations he was required to have, kept his workspace in the armory organized with the precision of a man who trusted tools more than he trusted company, and communicated in the fewest words the situation demanded. He had been this way since before Ivana arrived at Ironveil. He remained this way after. What changed, quietly, without announcement, was that he started leaving the armory side door unlatched on the evenings she passed through the eastern corridor on her household rounds, not open, just unlatched, so that if she happened to push it, it would give. She happened to push it, the 3rd week of her 3rd month at Ironveil. He was sharpening a blade at the workbench. He did not look up. She stood in the doorway and looked at the organized rows of weapons along the stone wall, the careful logic of how they were arranged, each thing in its exact right place, and said, without preamble, "You organize by function, not by size." He said, "Size is vanity." She said, "Agreed." She sat on the low stool near the door. He kept sharpening, Neither of them said anything else for several minutes. When she stood to leave, he set down the blade and said, without looking at her, "The back corridor gets cold after sundown. There's a second brazier that nobody uses. I can move it." She paused. "Thank you, Brennan." He picked up the blade again. "Tosh, it's a brazier. Don't make it a thing." She almost smiled. She left. After that, the armory side door was always unlatched on her evening rounds. She stopped in perhaps twice a week. They talked sometimes, briefly, practically, about things that mattered and things that didn't. He told her, on one of those evenings, that he had grown up 3 packs south and come to Ironveil at 19 because Magnus had offered fair terms and kept them. "He's not warm," Brennan said, running a whetstone along a blade's edge. "But he's honest. In my experience, that's rarer." Ivana considered this. "I know," she said. "I'm still deciding if it's enough." Brennan said nothing, but he nodded, once, in the way of someone who understood exactly what she meant, and had enough respect for her not to offer a comfortable lie in response. He saw her. Not fully, not the way a person who has known you for years can see you, but enough. Enough to register that she was real and complicated and worth the space she occupied. In a keep the size of Ironveil, that was not nothing. There was also Leo. And where there was Leo, there was Victor, because the universe had apparently decided they were a matched set, and no one had successfully argued otherwise. Leo was a broad, cheerful young warrior from Ironveil's southern garrison who talked the way rivers run, continuously, without particular destination, with occasional moments of surprising depth. Victor was his opposite, quiet, patient, with the particular energy of a man who had learned long ago that if he waited long enough, Leo would eventually reach the correct conclusion on his own. Or they had adopted Ivana somewhere around her second week at Ironveil, in the way that certain people adopt strays, not with sentimentality, but with a practical, uncomplicated loyalty that asked nothing in return. Leo had once spent 11 minutes explaining to Ivana his personal theory about why the Ironveil kitchen served the same soup on alternating Wednesdays. Victor had waited until he finished, then turned to Ivana and said simply, "They run out of the good broth. That's the whole theory." Leo had pointed at him. "That is reductive and lacks nuance." Victor had looked at Ivana. Ivana had looked at Victor. They had both, quietly, said nothing. These were the moments that kept her sane. It was the pack elder, Ruth, who named the threat. Ruth was perhaps 70, perhaps older, as in the way of women who have been old for so long, it stops being a relevant measurement. She had a face like carved driftwood and eyes that operated on a frequency slightly above the observable. She had been Ironveil's senior elder for longer than most of the pack had been alive, and she moved through the keep with the particular unhurriedness of someone who has already seen how most stories end. She found Ivana in the East Garden on a grey afternoon, sitting on the stone bench near the frost-burned hedgerow with a ledger balanced on her knee. Ruth sat beside her without asking. She looked at the dead garden for a long moment. Then she said, "Viola Ashcroft is watching you." Ivana did not look up from the ledger. "I know. She has been watching you since you arrived. I know that too." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Well, then, she is not watching you the way the others watch you. Curiosity, assessment, the ordinary politics of a new face in a familiar place. She is watching you the way a woman watches something she has already decided is in her way." Ivana set down her pen. "What does she want?" "What she has always wanted," Ruth said, without heat, "to be the most important voice in the room. For 20 years she has been the most important voice in that king's ear. You arrived and changed the geometry of the room, whether you intended to or not. A queen outranks an advisor. Viola knows this better than anyone. Ivana looked at the dead hedgerow. I haven't done anything to threaten her position. You don't have to, Ruth said. You simply have to exist in it. She stood, slowly, and with the dignity of someone who has earned the right to move at their own pace, and smoothed her dark robe. She looked at Ivana with those too perceptive eyes. Be exactly who you are, she said. The right ones will see it. The wrong ones will show themselves. She left. Ivana sat with that for a long moment, her pen still between her fingers, the cold garden quiet around her. Viola Ashcroft was polished the way weapons are polished, not for beauty, but so that nothing useful shows on the surface. She was perhaps 50, with silver-streaked dark hair always perfectly arranged, and a manner that managed to feel both warm and measuring simultaneously. She had served 3 generations of Ironveil's inner council. She knew every corridor, every alliance, to every pressure point in the Pack's political architecture, and she moved through all of it with the quiet confidence of someone who has never once been asked to leave a room. She was unfailingly courteous to Ivana. Every courtesy landed like a closed door. My queen, the Northern Lords prefer the East drawing room for afternoon meetings. I've taken the liberty of rescheduling yours. Rescheduled to a time that conflicted with 2 other obligations. My queen, I've drafted the border correspondence on your behalf to spare you the complexity. Correspondence that removed her name from 3 decisions she had already made. My queen, you look tired. Perhaps the evening council can proceed without you tonight. Each one delivered with perfect pleasantness, each one moving her, steadily, further from the center of things. Then there was Seraphine. Seraphine Varel was not unkind. That was the first thing Ivana had understood, and she had been careful not to forget it. She was warm, laughing, genuinely comfortable in large rooms and loud spaces in the way that people are when they have never had reason to feel otherwise. She had known Magnus since childhood, had grown up at Ironveil as the daughter of a noble ally family, and she moved through the keep with the ease of someone who had never been a stranger here. She was not pursuing Magnus. She was simply always present, always warm, always standing close in the way that old familiarity allows, with no awareness of how it looked, because she had never had to develop that awareness. Viola had cultivated this with the patience of a gardener. Ivana could see the architecture of it clearly, but from where she sat in the East Garden, with Ruth's words still settling around her like cold air. The advisor positioning the old friend, unknowing, simply being herself. And Ivana, the new queen, the political arrangement, the peace offering from a small pack 2 mountains south, quietly edited out of room after room after room. She looked down at her ledger. She picked up her pen. She finished the accounts. The victory announcement came on a Wednesday morning. A rider arrived at Ironveil's gates before dawn, and by the time the keep had properly woken, the news had already moved through every corridor like smoke under a door. The Greyveil War was over. The last rogue territory had surrendered at the border. Magnus had sent terms. They had been accepted. By midday, the Great Hall was already being dressed for celebration. It was at this celebration that Magnus and Seraphine humiliated her, which led to her leaving Ironveil. She walked through the rest of that night without stopping. The Ironveil Mountains rose on her left, black against a blacker sky, and she kept them there, a landmark, not a destination. She knew the lowland forest paths from the territorial maps she had studied in her first weeks at the keep, back when she had still believed that knowing a place thoroughly was the same as belonging to it. She moved by memory, and by the particular instinct her mother had spent years building in her. Read what is around you, Ivana. The forest tells you everything if you stop making noise long enough to hear it. She made no noise. She walked, or the first day passed in the way of days that are too large for ordinary accounting, measured not in hours but in the slow shift of light through the canopy above her, in the change of ground beneath her feet, from frozen mud to pine needle to stone and back again. She ate sparingly from what she had packed. She drank from a stream she heard before she saw, following the sound through the undergrowth until the water appeared, clear, fast-moving, cold enough to ache. She crouched at its edge and drank with her hands cupped. Her reflection looked back at her from the surface. Dark-haired, pale-faced, composed in the particular way of a woman who has decided composure is the only luxury she can afford. She kept moving. The mating bond ached. She had expected this. The bond was not a feeling she could switch off. It was structural, and woven into something deeper than emotion, and distance did not dissolve it so much as stretch it thin and taut, like wire pulled between two fixed points. It pulled at the space behind her sternum with a low, persistent insistence that she recognized and did not obey. She noted it the way she noted the cold, as a condition of the environment, not a directive. She kept walking. She stopped on the second evening. The forest had changed character through the day, denser, older, the trees wider and the canopy lower, the light coming through in long, pale columns that turned gold as the sun dropped. Her mother had taught her to read this kind of forest, the way the moss grew thicker on the north-facing bark, the way certain birds went quiet before rain, or the way a cluster of limestone outcroppings meant shelter nearby if you knew what shape to look for. She looked. She found it 20 minutes later, a stone structure, half collapsed, built into the side of a low ridge. Old enough that the forest had begun reclaiming it, vines along the eastern wall, the roof partially open to the sky. But the bones were sound. The walls still stood on 3 sides. The fourth could be managed. She stood in the doorway and assessed it the way her mother had taught her to assess everything. Not with feeling, but with function. What is here? What is missing? What can be done? She set down her pack. She got to work. She spent the first 2 days rebuilding what she could. She stacked fallen stones back into the gaps in the fourth wall, to chinked them with packed mud and dried moss, the way she had seen Silverfenn's builders do after hard winters. She cleared the interior, debris, old leaves, anything damp. She found a natural overhang in the ridge above the structure that would redirect rain away from the open section of roof, and she reinforced it with cut branches laid in overlapping layers, the same technique her mother had used for the summer lean-to at their old Silverfen property. Her hands blistered on the second day. She wrapped them and kept working. By the third morning, the shelter was functional, not comfortable, not warm by any standard she had previously considered warm, but sound, dry, defensible. Hers. She built the fire that evening with particular care, her mother's instruction precise in her memory after all these years. Small, hot, clean, hardwood only. Keep the smoke thin. A near smokeless fire means you chose your wood right and you chose your moment right. Smoke is a message. Only send it when you mean to. The fire burned small and almost clear. She sat beside it and ate what she had foraged through the day. Winter berries from the north-facing slope, the edible roots she had learned to identify from Silverfenn's healer before she was 12, pine nuts from the caches she had found under the snow near the eastern ridge. It was not much. It was enough. She organized her days around necessity. Mornings for foraging, moving in a widening radius from the shelter, mapping what was available and where, never taking more than the site could replenish. Middays for maintenance, the shelter, the firewood stack she was building against the eastern wall, or the small clay-sealed container she had fashioned to keep water clean. Afternoons for rest, because she was 7 weeks pregnant, and rest was not weakness, it was arithmetic. She was not happy. She was clear about this with herself. In the evenings when the fire burned low and the forest settled into its night sounds around her. She was not happy. She was grounded, which was a different thing entirely. Happiness was a quality of circumstances. Groundedness was a quality of self. She had learned the distinction young, and she had never confused them since. She was Ivana Moonridge. She was in a forest. She was rebuilding a stone shelter and foraging winter roots and carrying a child nobody knew about. She was not broken. She started talking to the baby in the evenings, not with sentiment. She was her mother's daughter, and her mother had never believed in softening truths for people just because they were small. She talked the way Lena Moonridge had always talked to her, directly, honestly, with the particular warmth of someone who respects their audience. "We are in a forest," she said, one evening, her hand resting against her stomach in the firelight. "It is cold. I have made it less cold. I will keep making it less cold. That is what we do. We find what is missing, and we do what can be done." The fire crackled. "You will not be born here," she said. "I don't know yet where you will be born. But it will not be a place that does not want you. That I can promise." She looked at the fire for a long moment. "Your grandmother would have liked this forest," she said, quietly. "She would have known every tree by name." Weeks accumulated. The shelter grew more organized, stacked wood along the eastern wall, drying cloth hung from the ceiling beams, her small supply of foraged food stored in the clay-sealed containers in careful rotation. The near-smokeless fire became effortless. The foraging routes became instinct. The mating bond continued its low, persistent ache. She noted it. She did not let it make her decisions. She was not waiting to be found. She was not waiting at all. She was simply living, fully, carefully on her own terms, in the way of a woman who had always known that survival is not the ceiling. It is the floor. And from the floor, if you are Ivana Moonridge, you build. Magnus woke to cold on her side of the bed. Not the cold of early morning, the particular cold of absence. Of a space that had been empty long enough for the sheets to lose all warmth entirely. He registered it before he was fully awake, the way the body registers wrongness before the mind has organized itself to name it. He sat up. The chamber was grey with early light. Still. The kind of stillness that has a quality to it. Not peaceful, but vacant. He saw the pendant immediately. It sat on the stone dressing table, exactly where she would have placed it if she had thought about where it would be found. Silver, deliberate, the frost mane crest facing upward. No note beside it. Nothing to explain. Just the pendant, set down with the quiet finality of a door closed from the other side. He stood at the dressing table for a long moment, looking at it. Then he picked it up, closed his fist around it, and walked out of the chamber. He went to Brennan first. Not to the council. Not to Viola. To the armory, where Brennan was already at the workbench at first light, because Brennan was always at the workbench at first light, and Magnus had known since Brennan's first year at Ironveil that this was the one place in the keep where he would get a straight answer without theatre. He set the pendant on the workbench. Brennan looked at it. Looked at Magnus. Said nothing. "She's gone," Magnus said. Brennan set down his whetstone. "How long?" "Through the night. Maybe longer." Brennan was quiet for a moment. Then, "The East Gate guards." They went together. The night guards described it in plain terms, because there was nothing complicated about what they had witnessed. The Queen had come through the Eastern Gate at approximately the second hour past midnight. She carried a single pack. She was dressed for weather. She walked at an even pace, not running, not hurried, not looking behind her. She knew exactly where she was going. They had stepped aside because no one had given orders to the contrary. "She looked like a woman with a plan," the younger guard said, then seemed to consider whether that was the right thing to say to the Alpha King, and decided it was too late to take it back. Magnus said, "You did the right thing, stepping aside." The guard exhaled. Magnus turned back to Brennan. Something moved behind his eyes, not yet the thing it would become when he understood the full shape of what had happened, but the beginning of it, the first edge of it. "She was on the balcony last night," he said. Not a question. Brennan met his eyes. "I don't know what she saw." "I do," Magnus said. But the pack reacted in the divided way of communities that have been quietly watching something, and have their own opinions about how it was always going to end. The senior warriors were confused. A queen leaving in the night without guard, without announcement, was a security matter before it was anything else. 3 of them immediately began drafting search protocols with the brisk efficiency of people who feel better when there is a procedure. Others were quieter about it. A kitchen elder who had watched Ivana reroute Petta's morning rounds said nothing when she heard the news, only pressed her lips together and looked out the window. A young pack mother who had seen Ivana acknowledge the border commanders by name at the feast said, "I hope she went somewhere good," and meant it. The pack was not unified in its grief. Some of them, quietly, were relieved for her. Leo and Victor were in the eastern corridor when they heard. Leo's immediate theory, delivered in one continuous breathless sentence, was that she had been taken, intercepted, possibly by Grey Veil remnants, possibly by external agents, possibly, he acknowledged when Victor's expression did not change, by someone with a specific motive and detailed knowledge of the keep's layout. Victor waited until he finished. Then he said, "She left. On purpose. She packed a bag, walked through the gate, and did not look back. We need to think about why." Leo opened his mouth. "Not theories," Victor said. "Why?" Leo closed his mouth. For perhaps 4 seconds he was silent, which was, for Leo, the approximate equivalent of a long and solemn meditation. Then, quietly, "Because something happened that we didn't see." "Yes," Victor said. "Something happened that we didn't see." Viola Ashcroft came to Magnus at mid-morning. She moved through the study doorway with her characteristic composure. Dark gown, silver hair arranged, the particular expression of a woman arriving with solutions to problems she has already categorized. She spoke of political implications, of the optics of a queen's disappearance during a victory period, of the importance of managing the council's interpretation before it became something less manageable. Magnus let her speak for approximately 30 seconds. Then he said, "Leave." Viola paused mid-sentence. "My king, the council will need... Leave this room," he said. "Now." She left. Magnus stood at his study window after she was gone, looking out over the Ironveil grounds, the frost-grey courtyard, the eastern gate, the mountain tree line beyond the walls where the forest began its long climb into the highlands. She had walked into that. Alone. At the second hour past midnight, with a single pack and her mother's hair pins and whatever else she had decided was worth carrying. He looked at the pendant, still closed in his fist. He had not let go of it since the dressing table. He thought about the balcony, about what she would have been able to hear from the gallery railing on a night when the music dipped and voices rose, about the 43 minutes she had been present at the feast before Viola had appeared at her elbow with a polite excuse and a non-existent northern delegation. He had not looked up. He had not looked up once. He pressed the pendant harder into his palm. Then he turned from the window, called for his riding gear, and went to find her himself. It was Leo who found them, not through any particular investigative brilliance. He was the first to admit this later to anyone who would listen, and several people who would not. He had been searching the council archive for the original border correspondence from the Greyveil negotiations on Victor's instruction, because Victor had a theory about the Eastern Route documentation that he refused to fully explain until he had evidence. Leo had pulled the wrong drawer. It happened because the archive's lower shelving was organized in a system that made sense exclusively to Viola Ashcroft, who had designed it, and Leo had never once in his life successfully navigated a system designed by someone who thought in straight lines. He found a bundle of letters in a leather folder tucked behind the Greyveil files. He almost put them back. Then he read the first line of the top letter, and he sat down on the archive floor, and he read all of them. Then he went and found Victor. Victor read them standing at the archive table, without expression, which was how Victor read everything. When he finished, he set them down and was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Get Brennan." The letters were Viola's, her hand, her seal, her particular brand of language that shaped truth without technically breaking it. There were 2 sets. The first set was addressed to 3 members of the External Territory Council. They documented, in carefully measured terms, Ivana's unsuitability as Luna, her origins in a small pack, her lack of experience with large territory politics, her apparent inability to integrate into Ironveil's social architecture. Nothing in the letters was an outright lie. Everything in them was angled, weighted, curated, the way a portrait can look exactly like a person while capturing nothing true about them. The second set was addressed to Seraphine. These were warmer in tone, written in the voice of a mentor, an advocate, a woman investing in a younger woman's future. They encouraged Seraphine's presence at council events. They suggested which evenings Magnus would benefit from familiar company. They framed Seraphine's closeness to the Alpha King not as something to be cautious about, but as something natural, right? Historically fitting. Seraphine had not known. This was evident in every line she had been sent. She had responded to mentorship with gratitude, to encouragement with warmth, with the complete openness of someone who believed she was being genuinely helped. She was not a villain in these pages. She was a pawn who had been handed a role without being told she was in a play. Brennan read the second set last, set them down, said very quietly. She saw all of this happening and said nothing because there was no one to say it to. Nobody responded, because there was nothing to add. They brought the letters to Magnus. He read them at his study desk, alone. He had asked them to wait outside, and they had, without argument. Through the closed door, there was no sound for a very long time. Then, silence of a different quality, the kind that comes before thunder, as when the air pressure changes and everything goes still. The door opened. Magnus stood in the doorway. His expression was the kind that has been very carefully arranged to contain something large. He said, "She was on the balcony." Not a question. Brennan said, "Yes." Magnus looked at the letters in his hand for a moment. Then he set them on the side table with a deliberateness that was somehow more frightening than force. "Find Seraphine," he said. "Bring her here. Gently." Seraphine arrived, not knowing what she was walking into. She left knowing everything. Magnus gave her the truth without cruelty, fully, plainly, without softening it in ways that would have been easier for both of them. He showed her the letters. He watched her read them. He watched the warmth in her face shift into something stunned, then grieved, or then quietly furious on behalf of a woman she had never truly been given the chance to know. "I didn't," she started. "I know," Magnus said. "You didn't know. That was the design." Seraphine looked at the letters for a long moment. Then she set them down and straightened and said, "Tell me what you need from me." "The truth," Magnus said. "When I ask for it, in front of the council." She nodded, once. "You'll have it." He went to Viola last. She was in her council office, composed, unsurprised, with the particular stillness of a woman who has been waiting to see which version of this conversation was coming. Magnus set the letters on her desk. She looked at them, said nothing. "You will remain at Ironveil," he said. "You will not leave these grounds. You will not communicate with the external council or with anyone outside these walls." He paused. "She stays until my mate comes home. I want her to watch it come apart." Viola looked up at him. For the first time in 20 years of advising kings, she had nothing to say. Magnus held her gaze for one long moment. Then he turned and walked out. He rode out before noon. No formal search party, no announcement, just Brennan at his side, and the bond pulling low and persistent in the space behind his sternum, stretched thin by distance, but there. She had not severed it. He did not know if that meant anything. He told himself it did not matter whether it meant anything. He was going regardless. He followed the eastern road until it dissolved into the highland forest, and then he followed the tree line north, and then he stopped following roads at all and simply followed the bond, the way you follow something you cannot see but cannot doubt, the way a compass follows north, not because it chooses to, but because that is the truest thing it knows how to do. She was out there. He rode. He had been riding for weeks, longer than he had told anyone he intended to, longer than was strictly rational for a king to be absent from his pack in a post-war period. And he had stopped caring about that somewhere around the 4th week, the morning when the forest closed fully around him, and Ironveil felt like something that existed in a different version of his life. The bond had been a pull the entire time, directional, persistent, the low ache of distance stretched to its limit. Then, 2 hours before he found her, it changed. It stopped pulling, but it became presence, warm and specific, the way a room changes when someone walks into it. Not closer yet, but real. Undeniably, unmistakably real. He said nothing to Brennan. He simply changed direction, leaving the trail entirely, moving through the older trees on instinct and on something that was not instinct at all. Brennan followed without asking questions. This was why Magnus trusted him. He smelled the fire first. Almost no smoke, just the faintest trace of it, the kind produced by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Hard wood, clean burn, chosen deliberately. He slowed. The shelter appeared between the trees. Stone walls, a repaired 4th side, branches laid in overlapping layers across the open section of roof. Cut firewood stacked with precision along the eastern wall. The drying cloth hung from a line strung between 2 iron hooks she had somehow fashioned and fixed into the mortar. A clay-sealed water container near the door, organized alongside 2 others of different sizes. He stopped at the tree line and looked at it. not survival. A life. She had built an entire life in here, with her hands and her mother's knowledge and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had never once waited for someone else to make things livable. Something moved in his chest that he did not have immediate language for. Then the doorway shifted, and she was there. She appeared in the shelter doorway with a bundle of firewood balanced against her hip, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her pale face wind-touched and calm. She was wearing her silver fen clothes, worn, practical, entirely herself. She saw him. She went completely still. The firewood stayed balanced against her hip. Her expression did not collapse into relief or fury or tears. It simply stilled. The way a surface stills after something large has moved through it. He saw her stomach. The world rearranged itself around him. Not slowly, all at once. The way understanding sometimes arrives, not as a gradual accumulation, but as a single structural shift that reorganizes everything that came before it. He looked at her, and he saw 7 weeks of absence, and he saw what she had been carrying alone through all of it, and something inside him came undone so thoroughly and so quietly that he was not sure he would ever find all the pieces. Behind him, he heard Brennan take 1 step back. Then Brennan looked at the ground. This moment, his posture said, without words, "It does not belong to me." Ivana set the firewood down against the doorframe, carefully, as if the ordinary gesture was the only thing keeping the moment at a manageable size. She looked at Magnus across the small clearing between them. He had not moved from the tree line. She said, "You came?" Her voice was even, not cold, just steady. The voice of a woman who had decided, somewhere in the weeks of forest solitude, that she was not going to perform any version of this moment that wasn't entirely true. He said, "I would have kept looking forever." She looked at him for a long moment. Forever is a long time. "Yes," he said, "it is." He crossed the clearing. He stopped 2 feet from her, close enough that the bond, which had been stretched thin and aching for weeks, went suddenly, completely quiet. Not gone, just home. He did not reach for her. He did not defend himself or explain himself or offer the speech he had been composing in his head across weeks of riding through highland forest. He simply looked at her, fully, the way he had never quite managed inside the walls of Ironveil, and she let herself be looked at, which was its own kind of courage. "I'm sorry," he said. No context, no justification, no architecture of explanation built around the words to make them easier to say. Just the words, set down plainly, the way she had set the Frostmane pendant on the dressing table, with the quiet finality of something that meant exactly what it was. She held his gaze. Then she looked down at her stomach, back up at him. "Can I?" she said. He understood immediately. He took her hand, gently, as if she were something he was only now understanding the value of, and placed it against her stomach, beneath his own. Something undid in him at the contact. Physical. He felt it in his palm, in the space behind his sternum, where the bond lived, in the specific architecture of everything he had been since the night she walked through the eastern gate, and nobody stopped her because nobody thought she would go. He had not cried since he was 9 years old. He did not cry now, but it was a near thing, and he did not pretend otherwise. They spent 2 extra nights in the forest, not formally, not with the careful measured language of the council table or the protocol-governed silences of Ironveil's great hall, but they sat beside her near smokeless fire, and they talked the way people talk when they have stopped performing for each other, plainly, sometimes painfully, occasionally with the particular dark humor of two people who have both made serious errors and know it. He told her about the letters, about Viola, about Seraphine, who had not known and who was waiting to testify. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I saw it happening. I didn't know how to name it." "You shouldn't have had to name it alone," he said. She looked at the fire. "No," she said. "I shouldn't have." He accepted that. He did not argue with it or soften it. He let it be exactly as true as it was. On the second night, she told him about her mother, about the morning after the fever, about the breakfast she had made at 11 years old, about the particular shape that loss takes when it arrives before you are ready, and then simply becomes the new architecture of your life. He listened the way she had listened, without interrupting. When she finished, he said nothing for a while. Then, "She sounds like someone worth knowing." "She was," Ivana said. "You would have found her difficult." "Probably," he said. "She would have liked that about you," Ivana said. It was the first time, in 8 chapters of this story, that they both almost smiled at the same moment. Almost. On the third morning, she let him carry the firewood. He did not make it mean more than it was. It meant everything. They rode back to Ironveil on the third morning. Ivana did not ask if she was ready. She already knew the answer. Readiness was not the point. The point was that she was Ivana Moonridge, and she had never once in her life waited until conditions were perfect before doing what needed doing. Magnus rode beside her, not ahead. This was new. She noticed it without commenting on it. Some things are better received in silence. The Ironveil Mountains came into view mid-afternoon, grey and enormous against a pale winter sky. The keep's towers visible above the tree line long before the gates appeared. She looked at them steadily. The bond, fully settled now, registered nothing that felt like dread. She straightened in the saddle. She rode in. The pack was at the gates. Not summoned. Nobody had sent word ahead. No announcement had been made. They had simply come. But the way communities come when something true is about to happen, and the body of the pack feels it before the mind does. Warriors and kitchen staff and pack mothers with children at their hips, the border commanders she had learned by name, the young guard who had stepped aside at the eastern gate and spent 3 weeks hoping he had done the right thing. They lined the path from the gates to the keep entrance on both sides. Nobody cheered. Nobody performed. They simply stood and bore witness, which was the older and more honest form of welcome. Ruth was at the front. The pack elder stood at the center of the path with her driftwood face and her 2 perceptive eyes, and her hands folded in front of her dark robe. When Ivana rode through the gates, Ruth looked at her, fully, without surprise, and nodded once, at the nod of a woman who had known exactly how this story ended from the moment she sat down on the East Garden bench and said, "Be exactly who you are." Ivana nodded back. Leo was crying. He was standing beside Victor at the left side of the path, his broad face entirely undone, tears running freely down his jaw with the absolute commitment of a man who had abandoned all pretense of composure and had no regrets about it. Victor stood beside him with his hands clasped behind his back, looking straight ahead, his expression the careful neutral of a man who was also crying, but had made different choices about acknowledging it. Ivana looked at them as she passed. Leo made a sound that was approximately the word "finally" filtered through significant emotion. Victor said, without turning his head, "Oh, we're very glad you're home." She almost stopped. She kept riding, but she pressed her lips together and looked straight ahead, and the thing she felt in that moment was not something she had a name for, only that it was warm and it was real, and she had not known until Ironveil that she had been capable of missing people she had only known for 3 months. The Pack Council convened the following morning in the Great Hall, the same hall blazing now with winter daylight instead of celebration fire, the long tables arranged in formal council configuration, the stone saints watching from their alcoves with their usual impartiality. Brennan stood at the side wall, arms crossed, expression closed. Leo and Victor sat in the witness row, Leo with unusual stillness, Victor with his hands flat on the table. Ruth sat at the elder's chair at the head of the council arc, composed and absolute. The letters were read aloud by the council recorder, all of them, both sets, in their entirety. The hall was very quiet while this happened, the kind of quiet that has weight. Seraphine testified. She stood and told the truth without hesitation, without performance, without softening a single detail. She described the letters she had received, the encouragement she had believed was genuine mentorship, the specific evenings she had been guided toward, the specific spaces she had been positioned in. Her voice was steady throughout. When she finished, she sat down and looked at her hands, and did not look up again for a long time. She had not known. The council heard it clearly. Viola Ashcroft was given the opportunity to speak. She stood. She was composed, perfectly, entirely composed, in the way of someone who has decided that composure is the last thing she owns, and she will not surrender it. "I acted," she said, "in the best interests of this pack." Ruth let the words settle in the air for a moment. Then the pack elder said, in the quiet, untheatrical tone of someone who has lived long enough to know the difference between truth and its imitations, "That is the best interests of your own vision of what this pack should be. Those are not the same thing. They have never been the same thing." Viola had nothing to answer this with. The council elder to Ruth's left called for the vote. It was unanimous. Viola was removed, not banished, not publicly humiliated, not met with cruelty of any kind. She was simply, finally, and completely relieved of her position, and escorted from the hall by 2 council members who did their jobs with professional dignity. She walked out under her own power. She did not look back. Ivana watched her go from her seat at the council table, Magnus's right, where she had always been supposed to sit, and felt nothing that resembled triumph, only the specific, clean feeling of a door that has been stuck for a long time, finally closing properly. Magnus reached across the table. He placed his hand over hers, not grasping, not claiming. Simply there. She looked down at it. Then she turned her hand over and held his. The baby came in late autumn season. The mountains had gone amber and red, and the first cold had moved down from the highland passes. And Ironveil smelled of wood smoke and pine and the particular sharpness of a world preparing to rest. Ruth delivered the child, as she had delivered many before, with the efficient, unhurried competence of a woman who had seen every possible version of this moment and remained moved by all of them. Magnus had asked to be present. He had asked, not assumed, not commanded. He had stood in the doorway the evening before and said, "May I be there?" And the fact that he asked was the thing Ivana remembered longest afterward, longer than the pain, longer than the exhaustion, longer than almost anything else about that night. She had said yes. The baby had her coloring and his jaw. Dark-haired, strong-faced, with Ivana's wide grey eyes looking up at the torchlit ceiling of the chamber, with the profound or unimpressed attention of someone encountering existence for the first time and reserving judgment. Magnus sat beside the bed. He looked at the child for a long time without speaking. Then he rested his forehead gently against Ivana's, without words, without ceremony, without any of the formal architecture that had surrounded every significant moment of their early life together. Just his forehead against hers. Just that. She closed her eyes. Outside the chamber, on the long stone bench in the corridor, Leo and Victor sat side by side. Leo was crying again, with the same full commitment as the day at the gates, apparently having decided that this was simply who he was now, and he had made his peace with it. Victor sat beside him with his arms crossed and his jaw set. His eyes were very bright. "I'm not crying," Victor said. "I know," Leo said, through tears. "I just have something in my eye." "Both eyes," Leo said. "It's dusty in this corridor." "It's stone," Leo said. "It's a stone corridor." Victor said nothing. Leo put a hand on his shoulder. Neither of them spoke again for a while. Below in the courtyard, the pack had gathered without being asked. They stood in the cold autumn evening, breath rising in small clouds, looking up at the lit window of the chamber above. When the baby's first sound carried down through the stone, small, certain, alive, something moved through the crowd that was not quite sound and not quite silence. Someone began to celebrate. Then everyone did. This time, Ivana was not watching from above. She was at the center, where she had always belonged, in the room where the most important thing was happening. Her child in her arms, her husband's forehead against hers, the pack's future breathing steadily in the amber light. She was not waiting. She was not watching. She was home. Thanks for watching. Ivana didn't wait to be chosen. She chose herself. And if this story hit you the way I think it did, if you felt that balcony, that silence, that pendant left behind without a note, then you belong here. Subscribe to Amy's stories, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me which moment broke you open and where in the world you are watching from tonight. See you in my next video.